Good morning and welcome to the Computer Channel. Today's Dossier programme is the second in our series on CASE, Computer-Aided Systems Engineering. CASE is a new disciplined approach to engineering and to software development. You need to convert programmers to new practices, find the right software tools for them to use, integrate these products with your existing systems and set up procedures to ensure those systems are then properly maintained. In the last programme we looked at what CASE is and what it can do. Today we take a long, hard look at IBM's long-awaited CASE offering, the Applications Development Cycle, or AD Cycle, launched on the 19th of September 1989. At the grand unveiling in New York, IBM called AD Cycle its blueprint for a productive future. Well, in the next 60 minutes, my three guests will analyse AD Cycle in some detail and discuss whether it really is the productive future IBM says it is. Jeff Hosier is Research Director at IBM Consultancy Zephon. This morning he's opening the programme by giving us an introduction to AD Cycle. Robert Baldock is a partner in Anderson Consulting with special responsibility for CASE. This morning Robert looks at what you need in place to take advantage of AD Cycle and takes a critical look at the separate elements which make up this quite complex environment. My final guest, Roger Tagg, is an independent consultant and will talk about making AD Cycle work, at least as far as it goes. Remember, Dossier is the programme where you can phone in and talk to our experts with me here in the studio. The number to ring is 081 681 5280, 081 681 5280. The phone lines are now open and we'll try and answer your calls in the 3 or 4 minutes we have between presentations. Well, first, Jeff Hosier. Jeff.
Over the last 20 years or so, if you had asked DP managers in the IBM mainframe world what their most intractable problems were, right at the top of the list you'd have found the applications backlog. DP departments just couldn't produce applications fast enough to meet users' needs, and the lead time for new applications just kept on growing. IBM more or less ignored this situation until around about 5 years ago, when it suddenly sat up and took notice. Why? Quite simply, it was losing business. If you haven't got applications to run on your mainframes, then there's no point in having a mainframe, and that's what IBM sells. IBM identified this inability to create applications as the most important single obstacle to the growth of computer systems. In a business where the price performance of the hardware is improving at about 15% a year, you've got to be able to keep consumption growing at that level at least, just to keep your revenues constant. If you want to grow your revenues in real terms, you have to increase the user's hardware requirements by more than 15%. And that means making sure that people can build useful application systems very much more quickly than they have in the past. Now, IBM's instinctive reaction when it's faced with any kind of difficulty in promoting its business is to go away and design an architecture. And what it means by an architecture is some kind of grandiose scheme which defines a set of standards and interfaces and which will enable people to build systems of a particular kind. Uncharitable people who tend to call these things marketectures reckon that their main objective is to create a proprietary standard to lock IBM's competitors out of its market. IBM, on the other hand, presents its architectures as a way of bringing order to an otherwise muddled world. And the truth is somewhere in the middle. What typically happens is that IBM's architectures give it a strong competitive edge for a strictly limited period, and then they create a new and open market. SNA, for example, is often described as a proprietary architecture which locks out IBM's competitors. And the fact of the matter is that the market opened up by SNA is now as open and as competitive as the market for the public domain OSI architecture. For application development, IBM has two key architectures. It has SAA, which tells you what kinds of applications IBM is going to help you to build, and which we're not going to talk about in great length, and AD Cycle, which tells you how to build them. To understand what AD Cycle is about, we need to go back to the idea of the software life cycle. AD Cycle is an attempt at getting together a set of standards and interfaces for this life cycle, and for the tools and software services that you need to run it effectively. So you need tools to support various processes within the life cycle, and you need standards and interfaces to enable you to carry software around the life cycle. And you'll need some kind of system to manage the whole thing. Here's a picture of the kinds of things that IBM likes to talk about within AD Cycle. And the foundation of IBM's AD Cycle strategy is a common repository, which contains everything you're ever going to want to know about your system, your applications, and ultimately about your business. In a way, the repository is a computerized, cross-reference version of the manual documentation for all your applications. And it may come as something of a surprise to you, those of you who don't work in computers, to find out that this isn't already done, but do be assured that your DP departments have spent so much effort toiling away producing your applications that they've been unable to produce the ones that they need to make their own life easier. For the technically inclined, the repository is in effect a passive data dictionary based on DB2, which acts as a single reference source for all the information that otherwise would be held on paper, or in some cases, in the head of the last programmer but 3 to work on the project. It's a very complex system, and it took IBM an awfully long time to get its repository implementation out. It became generally available a couple of months ago. Now, although the repository provides the underpinnings of the whole AD Cycle edifice, it's not actually essential to use the repository itself to use AD Cycle. Remember, AD Cycle is a set of specifications as much as it's a set of products. And there are plenty of good things within AD Cycle that you can use independently of the repository. For example, how can you manage the various components of the life cycle? Here IBM has something it calls ADPS, Application Development Project Support, which is the project management system within AD Cycle. It's based on some work done by IBM in Vienna. It runs in the mainframe, and it consists of software to support planning, development, quality control within a development project. Notice it's not actually a development tool, strictly a project management system tailored specifically to software development projects. Within AD Cycle itself, there are various tools and IBM products which support traditional development. So you'll find IBM's application generator, CSP, which incidentally nobody seems to like overmuch. You'll find programming language systems, testing tools, debuggers, and you'll find support for methodologies. And if you use any one of the approved versions of these, the AD Cycle message is that you're in the IBM mainstream, and even if you're using the product in isolation, you're not locking yourself out of a subsequent move into a closer involvement with AD Cycle. So why should application development be quicker or better in any sense using the AD Cycle approach? Well, the key to its potential success, and it is still a potential success, no one's actually proved it yet, is the notion of integrating the whole development process around the repository. DP generally has taken a very piecemeal approach to development, and the repository within AD Cycle should provide a means of integrating the whole development process so that people won't spend time reinventing wheels, software quality ought to improve, and particularly maintenance should be simpler. And there is strong evidence from other repository-driven approaches to development that these kind of benefits are perfectly achievable. How good is AD Cycle at the present? Well, the answer appears to be not very. The core of the whole thing is the repository, and the early report sites aren't exactly waxing lyrical over it. The view of at least one early user is that the current release gives you access to only about 25% of the functionality that will eventually appear, and it's also being criticised for being slow and memory intensive. Now, there's nothing unusual about early releases of computer products being pretty poor, and it would definitely be very premature to write off AD Cycle right now. Really, this first release of the repository software was mainly intended for the independent software vendors to use to test their own software. It really was never meant to be a customer version. As to the other components of AD Cycle, they really fade into insignificance besides the repository. And in terms of what users should do today, I can't really see any merit in throwing out a current non-AD Cycle product and replacing it with an AD Cycle product, unless that change is justified strictly on the merits of the new product. Finally, note that although AD Cycle is an IBM invention, IBM is not the only source of AD Cycle products. IBM was very active in involving independent software vendors in AD Cycle at an early stage, and it even went to the expense of buying equity stakes in third-party software developers to ensure that they'll help flesh out the AD Cycle skeleton. So a move into AD Cycle is unlikely to be a move into the clutches of IBM. There are going to be plenty of competitive products around to choose from.
Thank you, Jeff. What sort of benefits would you say that AD Cycle brings? Sort of basic 4 or 5 pointers that you'd say.
I think the benefits are going to be a clearer understanding of what your application's problems are. Certainly in the long term, once you have all your business systems modelled correctly, the maintenance workload is going to be made far, far simpler. And the whole of the software development process is going to be much more disciplined and automatically documented, and we won't get into the kind of tangles and messes we get in today with unmaintainable software.
Is what AD Cycle is offering then really new, or is it just a sort of evolution of a sort of carry on from what we're doing normally anyway?
It's like so many things that IBM produces. IBM is not, within the software side of its business, a great innovator. IBM is, in a sense, its main role is to give a stamp of approval to techniques that have been developed in academic environments or in rather more dynamic kind of environments. And I think that's what it seems to be doing with AD Cycle. It's taken some well-tried and tested tools that have come from the consultancies and from various other disciplines, and it said, we now recognise this is the way things have to be done, and here is our infrastructure that will enable you to do this within an IBM mainframe world.
Robert, would you agree with that?
Yes, I would. IBM hasn't really invented anything here. If it's invented something, I think it's invented the concept of component case. If you look at how case has evolved, first and foremost, people came out with a number of specific tools addressing specific parts of the life cycle that Jeff was speaking about, such as tools to support analysis. And then people wanting to cover the life cycle went out and bought different point tools from different organizations. But then they found problems of bringing them all together and making them work in conjunction with each other. The response to this from the software vendors was to start to develop what became known as integrated case tools, which cover the entire life cycle, which gave people a much more user-friendly, more productive way of working. But it also gave people a few concerns about locking themselves into those vendors because they were relying totally on that one vendor. So what IBM has come up with is an architecture into which you can use either IBM products or third-party products in conjunction with each other. And I think it gives people who are IBM users more comfort that they're not locking themselves into a path which could take them off the end of a large cliff. They have confidence in IBM, and therefore it gives them more confidence in going down the case route.
Roger, is this not just, though, a case of jam tomorrow, if you like?
Well, I think it is. I think we've yet to see how well that all works. I think there's some suspicion that too much use of a component approach may mean that users are faced with having to pick up incompatible concepts between the different building blocks of those components.
Is there no overall standard, though, that particularly conforms to IBM's grand blueprint, if you like?
Well, I think this is the one thing we're missing in this industry right now, which is a standard. IBM is trying to create a standard in the same way that it tried to create a standard with SNA, and opposing that were initiatives like OSI. So IBM is trying to create a standard, but the most important place where we need a standard is the information model, the thing that's implemented within the repository. And I see no likely prospect of such a standard coming out from an independent source. IBM will try to make their information model a standard. And it's been very clever by going down this AD Cycle route and getting vendors to want to sort of work to AD Cycle. It's effectively bonding them to their standard, because that's the only way you'll be able to use these tools in conjunction with each other if they take the same view of the world. But Roger had a good point, which is that's not the situation today. Each of these third-party tools that can be used as part of the AD Cycle framework don't take the same view of the world. And it's going to be a long while, if ever, before they reach that point.
The repository, actually, Jeff, is a pretty crucial part of it. You said that it's slow, memory intensive and everything else. What needs to be done? First of all, what are the drawbacks to the repository at the moment? And second, what needs to be done to make it a bit more punchier and work more efficiently?
I think that most of the drawbacks are really to do simply with the fact that it's an early product that just is not evolved well enough. It's always been the case. DB2 itself was a very poor performer for the first couple of years. It really is just a question of waiting for it to get better and for IBM to work very hard to make it better.
Rob, will people have to conform to a repository standard, do you think, in order to sort of make their products work with it?
The vendors that are looking to demonstrate they can be used in conjunction with AD Cycle will have to ultimately conform to the information model that IBM has created. But here and now, they're working to their own information models, and I think what we're looking at is having to bridge different views of the world. And I don't think anyone's really sat down and worked that out yet and worked it through. The people that buy AD Cycle, the vendors that are committing to AD Cycle, I'm not sure they've really thought through how they're going to synchronize the different views of the same world. Because within our industry, we can't agree on terminology or something as simple as that, nevertheless a model of the world that we're trying to build.
Roger, do you agree with that?
Well, yes, I would. I think there's an issue that already to incorporate the linking with the various vendors' products that AD Cycle is working with. The repository has to contain a lot of perhaps complementary views of the world. And there is a suggestion that the number of concepts that that repository will have to contain to support just the existing set of collaborative vendors will be quite large. And so there won't be perhaps be one very detailed standard information model. It may have to contain a lot of alternative views.
It can't really win, can it? It's either too narrow, it's accused of being too proprietary, and too wide. So it's that virtually useless because it incorporates too many things.
Exactly, yes.
All right, well, my next guest is Robert Baldock. This morning, Robert looks at what you need in place to take advantage of AD Cycle and takes a critical look at the separate elements which make up this quite complex environment. Robert.
The launch of AD Cycle in September '89 was enthusiastically received by IBM users, case vendors, and the majority of people from within my own world of technology and business consultancy. But why such a warm and enthusiastic response? Well, IBM's announcement legitimized the whole area of computer-aided systems engineering. When Big Blue backs a new technology, it immediately gets the industry seal of approval. What's more, AD Cycle gave everyone an architecture upon which they could build, a template, a blueprint, a standard to which everyone could now work. The relief that at last someone had blazed the trail was, however, tempered a little by the questions it also raised. Could IBM's solid gold solution, after all, be only gold plate? Let's look at what sort of businesses stand to benefit from using AD Cycle. First, they must all possess an IBM mainframe, because the repository is mainframe-based. Second, AD Cycle requires the use of OS/2 workstations, which are rather expensive. Now remember, the majority of IBM users still operate under DOS, so they'll be forced to opt for something radically new, something which, incidentally, has still to be proven. The jury is still out on the issue of OS/2, and some people are rather less than impressed. Third, AD Cycle only supports the development of 3270 style applications. We're already seeing major companies, particularly financial institutions, moving towards a cooperative processing environment, one in which networks of intelligent processors communicate in real time. So perhaps it could be short-sighted and even short-lived to limit applications to the dumb terminal age. Organizations which meet these prerequisites stand to benefit in a number of ways. I believe that a complete set of tools working under the same architecture and accessing the same repository can result in a significant productivity boost. Most of this benefit can be attributed to having all of the analysis and design information in one repository. One copy only of a particular piece of information shared by everyone in the enterprise will ensure consistency and save a lot of time. However, we have to be realistic in our expectation of the likely productivity gains. 3 years ago, my organization developed a product called Foundation, a full lifecycle case tool with its own repository. Using this tool, our clients have successfully developed a number of major systems. Their experience suggests that you can usually attain a 20% productivity gain in development. Now, on face value, this may not sound very much, but on a major project, 20% of a large number can be a very large number indeed. We also expect to see substantial reductions in maintenance effort. Again, results from applying Foundation suggest a reduction in effort of up to 50%. If AD Cycle can realize these levels of saving, then it will be worthwhile indeed. I also believe that IBM will breed confidence. Whenever Big Blue steps into any arena, you can count on the fact that they won't bow out in a hurry. AD Cycle may have flaws, but they'll work on it, refine it, develop it, and in the end, give it a guaranteed future. Finally, I also believe that AD-Cycle's components, or as IBM call them, tiles, offer a wide choice of tools. You can use what you already have in place, or you can opt for something new. The choice and scope will, I believe, be seen as an obvious and very attractive strength. But, and here comes the bottom line, there's one big snag, a 7-figure snag. The cost of introducing AD-Cycle will be well over £1 million, if you include the cost of extra hardware. In many instances, it could even prove more costly. So, whichever way you look at it, this is not going to be a cheap exercise. Nor, for that matter, is it going to be a quick one. To justify £1 million plus price tag, companies must see a significant business benefit. Unfortunately, in the case of AD-Cycle, this simply isn't possible today. To put it bluntly, the product is incomplete, and it will remain so for at least 2 to 3 years. The promise is there, but IBM simply cannot deliver here and now. However, others can. There are many independent vendor products that can deliver that promise today rather than tomorrow. What's more, some of them can deliver that promise to people who are not solely wedded to IBM technology. If you're in a mixed hardware environment and are committed to AD-Cycle, the question that must be uppermost in your mind is, what tools should I, or even can I, use to develop applications for non-IBM machinery? For example, in a digital environment, should companies choose the cohesion route, digital's own equivalent of AD-Cycle? And, if companies do decide to use different tools, how on earth can they maintain a single repository? One solution to these very real questions is to reach for products that are consistent with AD-Cycle and the case strategies of other vendors. AD-Cycle's market potential is clear to see, but so also are the inadequacies. Let me illustrate this point by taking you back to the basic components, or tiles, which lock together to create the IBM product. For a start, you have to appreciate that AD-Cycle is heavily reliant on third-party tools that offer their own repositories. IBM's repository has rather limited capability today, so it cannot even start to replace these third-party repositories. Data duplication is, therefore, a very real and serious concern. Equally, so are the overlaps between tiles. When you look at the total picture, you can see many areas where third-party tools compete with each other, not to mention the obvious overlaps between IBM and third-party tools. All this duplication must be counterproductive. Quite clearly, the tiles need to be trimmed to fit. What's more, the architecture not only suffers from overlaps, it also exposes huge gaps between tiles. Look closely and you'll discover some very fundamental functional inadequacies. Some of the tools that IBM are now offering have very restricted applicability. For example, IBM's own application generator, CSP, does not always provide efficient code. It's certainly not suited to complex applications. These gaps have got to be filled, and someone's going to have to do a lot of bridging to create an acceptable interface. Gaps, overlaps, duplications. The picture is not a happy one. AD-Cycle is fragmented, inflexible, and incomplete. It promises a lot, but delivers rather less than expected. I have no doubt that it will, one day, bring significant benefits to IBM mainframe users. Having put their hand to the plough, IBM will never look back. They will hack it. The only question is when. Because right now, AD-Cycle has 3 serious flaws. It's costly, it's incomplete, and it's certainly not suitable for everyone.
Thanks very much, Rob. What you talk about, obviously, non-IBM solutions as part of AD-Cycle. One assumes that AD-Cycle is very proprietary. What sort of solutions could you incorporate into the AD-Cycle? For example, do you need OS2? Do you need PS2 workstations? Obviously, you need DB2. But what other elements, non-IBM elements, can you put in there to perhaps make more of a sort of PCM solution rather than IBM?
PCM isn't really the issue. The issue could well be related to an example where a client has IBM and, say, digital equipment.
Yes.
A lot of the utilities in this company, the water boards, have IBM mainframes and distributed digital environments.
Yes.
Now, historically, people who've had a mixed environment have had two sets of development teams with possibly 2 sets of development tools. Now, we don't build applications in isolation. At the end of the day, we have the information come together to present management at the top with a corporate view of the enterprise. So if we've got 2 sets of tools, AD-Cycle and, let's say, Cohesion, they are working towards populating an IBM repository on one side and a digital repository in another. So how are you going to bring that together at the end of the day? Well, one possible solution lies in choosing a vendor that puts something in front of other vendors' architectures to give a sort of consolidated view, if you like, of the world. They deliver their information into the chosen IBM AD-Cycle environment or the Cohesion digital environment. So part of the answer, if you're a mixed environment, is to look for tools that will front-end AD cycle and cohesion. If you're an IBM-only user, and you're an IBM mainframe user, because this is key, because you need the IBM mainframe for DB2 in the repository, then you have a choice of tools that you could use. And today, yes, you could buy DOS-based tools that will ultimately take you into the IBM repository. But IBM is pushing all of its partners down the OS2 route. A skeptic might suggest because they're trying to encourage the sales of PS2s that are required to run OS2. But it's interesting to note that whereas the rest of the industry is recognizing that DOS has got a long way to go yet before we can start talking about OS2, IBM is encouraging all of its partners that are part of AD Cycle to move their applications onto OS2.
But they quite clearly are, aren't they, Roger? I mean, it's obviously having to get a lot out of its revenues, certainly from the software side, and it quite clearly is pushing PS2s and OS2s like Bilio to the detriment of the quality of what it's offering, presumably.
Well, I think in the short term that could be so. I think it remains to be seen yet what other independent vendors will do. I think we're going to see a lot more tools come in which link in with AD Cycle, and it'll be interesting to see how many of them can pick up the PS2, OS2 aspect of it.
What about the plug-compatible people like Amdoc, most of the Hitachi PCMs? Have they got a similar sort of solution, or are they planning to offer something like AD Cycle in their own environment?
Well, I would only imagine that this would be part of what they would have to do. There's no really other way for them. If they're going to be truly plug-compatible, they will have to take the whole thing aboard.
What's
the sort of customer reaction been to all this, Jeff, so far?
I think a certain amount of suspicion, not as Robert said, when it first came out, it seemed to be a move that legitimised a lot of things that have been hovering around the fringe of the IBM mainstream. So they certainly applauded it at that point. But in terms of the deliverables, there is very little about at the moment, and people are somewhat suspicious of it. As Robert said, it's going to cost you £1 million. You're going to need Model 70s with about 12 megabytes of store and about 115 megabyte hard disk just per workstation, per programmer, and that's a lot of money. IBM is really targeting it at its large sites. They have to be MVS sites to get DB2, and they're talking about the whole concept is really only for sites which have got at least 100 programmers writing applications. So it's not for the small people, it's definitely for the large people. And at the moment, particularly in today's economic climate, I think they're all being rather circumspect about it.
But I only know about two sites, Standard Life and Pearl Assurance, so that the only people I know who are fairly active.
There are some in the States, but I believe they're the only two in the UK who have got, I believe, were early support programs sites.
What about productivity, Robert? How can you sort of get a rough idea of measuring productivity at this early stage, really? Obviously, there's a planning problem you have and how to mix certain tools. How do you then get onto the point of actually trying to gauge how productive these tools will be for you?
Well, the problem today is because AD Cycle is incomplete, it would be foolish to try and measure its productivity. You spoke about two sites that have the repository. Well, they can't do anything realistically with that repository because they don't have another layer of the AD Cycle called the AD platform in place, which actually provides the means to link together the tools to allow them to input and extract data from the repository. So today, I'd defy anyone to measure the productivity of AD Cycle. Measuring productivity in itself is quite a challenge, because productivity is what it's taking you to do it with these set of tools over what it would have taken you to do it without these set of tools. The only true way of doing that is to have the same people do the same task twice, but having done it once, they'll know better the second time. So I'm sort of very sceptical when I start seeing people claim huge productivity improvements over the previous approach, when it's very difficult to actually measure productivity unless you sort of go through the task twice, and then I mentioned there's a serious flaw there.
So there's no clear way of actually measuring, there's no way of seeing whether there's any advantage of buying AD Cycle at all compared to what you're doing now?
Not today.
It's
That's
very
quite
much
a serious problem, then, isn't it?
It's very much a gesture of faith. I mean, if you, as I said earlier, there is some evidence from products like Foundation or from IEF that you can get apparent productivity gains. You can get applications out of the door faster, and particularly you can maintain and modify them faster. But they're much more complete products. They're products that have been in development for a long, long time. And I think one of the points I made at the beginning of my talk was that this seems to have been a fairly sharp reaction by IBM just about 5 or 6 years ago, AD cycle. And it's not something that's been designed from scratch. It's been, in a sense, a superstructure that's been imposed on top of a large number of existing products. So it's not been designed right from the beginning. And you're not likely to be able to achieve the same productivity gains that people are achieving with properly designed products.
It's a sort of software blanket over your entire environment, presumably, does it?
It has, to some extent, yes. And it's tended to capitalise on some tools like CSP, COBOL, whatever, that already exist, that may well not be the way that we would start from if we were starting afresh from now. So you're carrying all these trappings around with you, which may well be a major impediment to being very productive.
Just very briefly, Roger, how is IBM selling it?
I think it's selling it as an architectural way of going at the moment. I don't think they're pushing it very hard as something that you can necessarily buy immediately and make immediate productivity gains out of. I think it's being sold as an approach to try and keep people in the orbit of IBM with the SAA architecture, which covers the range of equipment from mainframes down to the PS2s. And I think that's really what they're wanting to do, get the idea across that this is a system which supports application development, especially in the cooperative processing environments which they're trying to encourage.
Okay, well, we're going to get some user reaction in a moment anyway, but later on in today's programme, Roger talks at how you can actually implement AD Cycle, but first a look at some user reaction in a recent survey carried out by Coopers and Librand Deloitte. Alex Lester met CNL's top caseman, Reg Boguslavsky.
Coopers and Librand Deloitte to carry out the survey?
Well, with the immense growth in the use of case tools and mixed experiences of users of those tools, we wanted to gather together numbers of our clients and really look at how advanced they were in the use of these tools, to look at their experiences and see if there were any trends in terms of the benefits they were seeing and the problems they were getting.
Who were the respondents?
It was a broad spread of clients in terms of type and size of client, and the responses and their usage, I would say, was typical. We have an intention to carry out the survey on a wider front with our financial services and clients, and hopefully in the government area.
What were their main reasons for adopting CASE?
Well, really, they were looking for quality improvements in terms of better communications, analysis, and documentation. Largely in the early stages of the life cycle, that figured quite strongly, but also productivity improvements and reduced maintenance costs. Overall, they were looking for cost efficiencies to make it a worthwhile investment.
Were they getting what they expected?
In some cases, yes. In other cases, no. They perceived they were getting benefits in terms of cost efficiencies, in terms of better quality, but they saw problems in some areas in terms of they weren't reducing the application backlog with the use of CASE. They weren't getting any benefits in helping them manage and control their projects, and they weren't getting any benefits in terms of reusability of software. We also got some mixed responses in terms of productivity and better timing of delivery, mixed experiences in that respect.
Why were they experiencing these problems?
I think the problems came from two sources, really, both from the vendors and the users. I think there is over-expectations generated by the vendors, and that led to some problems. Also, training was quoted as an area where the vendors were lacking. As far as the users were concerned, there were problems seen in terms of integration of products with working procedures, and in terms of staff adapting to the use of the products.
Do you think some of the clients would prefer to use traditional non-CASE methods?
Well, some of our clients have very effective traditional third-generation language-based development environments, and in those cases the benefits for CASE must be weighed against that backcloth. CASE has to provide very significant advantages to move away from an already proven environment.
So CASE was better in terms of cost then?
It provided overall cost improvements, certainly. Compared with traditional methods, there was seen to be increased cost in the analysis and design stages of the life cycle, but that parallels the introduction of structured methods, and that's quite appropriate for getting better quality deliverables at the end of the day. Lower costs were seen in the build stage and testing stages and maintenance stages because of the improvements in quality that resulted from the use of CASE.
Overall, how popular was CASE with the companies?
Our respondents, we asked to score their use of these products in a range from 1 to 10. Overall, they said the rating was 7, so there looks to be a satisfactory response there.
Do you think perhaps with a rating of 7 they may have overestimated how good it was or how useful it was?
I think that's a possibility. CASE hasn't been used that extensively for very large projects. Those projects that it has been used on, clients have admitted to success, but then nobody likes to admit to failed projects, do they?
Alex Lester talking to Ray Boguslavsky from Coopers & Lybrand Deloitte about customer impressions of CASE. Well, in case you've just joined us, I have with me in the studio 3 CASE experts, Jeff Hosier, Robert Baldock and Roger Tagg. If you'd like to ask them any questions, then the number to ring is 081 681 5280. 081 681 5280. Well, you've listened to the overview and you've seen that piece of film there. Roger, obviously the Coopers & Lybrand report was actually quite scathing and people hadn't taken up CASE quite as much as they'd hoped to and everything else. One of the major problems was the sort of organisational change you need to put in place to be able to get the most out of CASE, and that really wasn't there in a lot of their sort of respondents.
Yes, I think that's very much the case in my experience. I think you find that people assume that by putting in the CASE tools, they're somehow going to be able to improve the productivity and get the benefits. And yet, people perhaps don't really know what training and what reorientation and perhaps what changes in the organisation are actually required. And so there is going to be a lag before people can reap those benefits, I think.
Rob?
I would agree. I see too many people stumbling into CASE. They don't treat it as a project in its own right. What we're putting in place here are some tools that will change the way in which people do their job, the job being systems development. Now, we put some discipline around putting in a new system for an end user. We prepare the way, we educate them, we train them, we hold their hands, we evaluate the use, and we, at the end of the day, say, has it achieved the benefits we're looking for? But I see too many people buy 1 or 2 copies of an analyst workstation, give it to a few people and say, use CASE. Now, you're only going to use it if you apply it to a real-life application, because that makes you want to make it work. You've also got to understand the environment you have to put in place, the support environment, to make sure those people don't waste time understanding the tool and they apply the tool productively. So I get frustrated because I walk into organisations and I find they're not properly organised for the implementation of CASE, and that's, in my opinion, more often than not, why they don't get what they're looking for.
Jeff, would you agree with that?
Absolutely. One of the things I said at the beginning was that IBM's natural tendency when it comes across a problem is to build an architecture, and one gets the overwhelming impression that the natural tendency of many people, if they have a problem, is to go and buy a product. Now, that's not necessarily the right thing to do. I mean, perhaps what they should do is sit back, look at what they do and say, are we doing this the right way? Then decide what is the right way, if they're not doing it the right way, and then buy the product to support it, rather than dash out willy-nilly and buy products. I mean, that's an overstatement, but I think there's a good deal of truth in that. Products come first, and then people decide afterwards what they're going to do with them. And that's a very dangerous thing to do in this area.
Okay, we'll lead on to you now, Roger. I think really sort of you cover some of those points, I think. My final guest, Roger Tagg, is going to talk about making AD cycle work. Well, at least as far as it goes. Roger.
However desirable AD cycle may be as a way forward for the future, it is not something you can just pick up and run with. You need an implementation strategy, and this is something which needs a bit of thinking about. As has already been said, AD cycle is not so much a set of tools, but rather a framework. That framework supports a certain philosophy of applications development, one that may not be the same as you are using today. What is this philosophy? It isn't just that of CASE tools. Point 1, it starts with planning systems from a business-based integrated standpoint. Logical as this sounds, this is still foreign to many user organisations in the UK and Europe. IT is still commonly treated as a passive service department, where each user department request is treated as an input, which is then separately cost justified and implemented. Point 2, you should be developing applications in a disciplined manner. This isn't new, of course. Structured methods have been around for some time. What we are talking about here is using one of the so-called methodologies, which cover the AD life cycle. This doesn't mean a fully formal methodology in the sense that every design task is logically complete and mathematically provable, but it is systematic in the sense that outputs from one stage are used by succeeding stages. You may be using artificial intelligence to provide an automatic transition from one state of the design to another, but the analyst designer's judgment is still paramount. This point is emphasized by the use of the word engineering. This is both the letter E in case and part of the name of the methodology that goes by the title of information engineering. What AD Cycle and many of the third-party integrated case tools do is support just such an engineering approach. All these toolkits include the concept of a repository to contain the results of analysis and design at each stage and the link to other stages. What all this means is that it doesn't make sense to implement AD Cycle in the absence of an engineering as well as a whole business-based philosophy. What then are the prerequisites for starting down the AD Cycle path? I suggest we look at each point in turn. Firstly, the organisation has always prepared to undertake an Information Strategy Plan, or ISP, sometimes also called a Strategic Information Systems Plan. An ISP means a 3 to 6 month soul search in which you examine the whole range of the organisation's business objectives and practices, and you collect and prioritise the information needs which support the measurement of these. The results are worked into a set of models and a system development plan, which includes technical and organisational implications. It takes a lot of management commitment. ISP is not for an organisation that likes to keep its computer people as backroom boys. Without an ISP up front, AD Cycle will offer little advantage over any old stage-specific case tools. The integrating power of the repository and the whole life cycle framework would be badly underused. Further, you will have missed an opportunity to take a quantum leap in improving the relevance of your computer systems to business needs. The second prerequisite is that you have to be committed to a broad methodology covering the whole of the AD life cycle. This sounds easier, but in practice it is harder than one thinks. Your IT staff may have acquired all their skills on older methods. They may resent the restriction a methodology brings. People can also suffer from methodology indigestion, i.e. too many bright new ideas like structured analysis, data analysis, object-oriented analysis, and so on. Also, of course, success in a methodology requires a lot of training and familiarization through practice. Thirdly, the organisation has to be happy about working with one of the limited number of tools that are actually available in conjunction with AD Cycle in your timescale. AD Cycle is still very new, and at the moment only links to a very small selection of case tools. You can see some of the examples on the list. Besides these, there are several other products in the pipeline. One argument put forward in favour of AD Cycle, compared with third-party iCase tools like IEF, is that one can pick the best tool in each category. But at the present, with CSP as the only mainframe generator, there is a very limited choice of products to pick from. Finally, you do really need to be committed to IBM's SAA, which Jeff has already covered. Many users are a long way from being 100% IBM and have a lot of applications on Digital, HP, Tandem and others, not to forget networks of powerful PCs and Unix workstations. The SAA world does not cover such a mixture, and these users may well find other approaches better than trying to get AD Cycle compatible products on other ranges. iCase tools for mixed environments are already available, like Oracle's Case Method and Texas Instruments and JMA's IEF. The latter has just announced VAX RDB and Tandem generators, as well as Unix support. Supposing an organisation fulfills the 4 prerequisites, what sort of an implementation plan should it set up? Here's the suggested plan. After you've chosen your overall methodology, you need to get your ISP in place, if this hasn't been done already. To support the ISP, you can use a toolkit, which could be one of the AD cycle planning tools. At this stage, you should be in a position to confirm or decide against use of AD cycle. Before launching into use of AD cycle on projects, especially in these early days with such a dearth of tools, it is worth doing some preparation work. Of course, the mainstream of this is to install the AD cycle framework components and individual case tools, and to train staff in both methodology and tools. Another preparatory task is to tailor the AD cycle framework, in particular the ADPS process manager, for your chosen methodology. You could also explore the use of ESF, external source format, as the standard for interchange between your upper and lower case tools, whether or not you intend to use CSP. The biggest thing you can do is to make a start on populating the repository. This means making a schedule to take on the design data on the systems you already have in place. You may be able to use reverse engineering to help on this. Some organisations are planning to start this process even before they install AD cycle. This is perfectly okay as long as they have a good data dictionary tool and methodology and do things in a way which helps eventual conversion into the AD cycle repository. Now you are ready to carry out the first analysis project, something serious but not too complex. Other analysis projects and also design and generation and testing projects then follow on. As time goes on, it is also worth keeping an eye open for any new or improved case tools that become available with AD cycle. To end with, just a warning. Going down the path of one particular methodology or repository is to all intents and purposes an irrevocable commitment. One thing in the computer field that is not likely to get easier for many years is transferring repository data from one system to another without losing some of the meaning. So in implementing AD cycle, you have to be prepared to burn your boats in the confidence that you won't have to go back later to a different approach to applications development.
Thanks, Roger. Well, as you said there about the methodology as input, I've done a report on the Couldwell and Librand, so it's a bit of a dog's breakfast, really. Obviously, everybody working with a number of methodologies. How do you choose the right one?
I think it's very much a matter of history, what you've been doing in the past. I think you need to take cognizance of what AD cycles can support, but one of the specific design aims of AD cycle was that it would allow you to tailor its use to a particular methodology. So IBM isn't trying to insist that you use any one type of methodology, although I think the loose term of information engineering does cover most of the way that the information model is set up in AD cycle and the repository.
Rob, can you use more than one methodology with the repository?
The methodology, I guess we ought to really be talking about one approach to systems building within an organisation. The question is whether the methodology you've chosen covers the different types of applications you're looking to build. I mean, most organisations have packages. Surprisingly few methodologies tell you how to go about selecting and implementing packages. Roger spoke earlier about expert systems. You really like to have a methodology that tells you how to go about analysing, designing and building expert systems. So we've spoken about how incomplete AD cycle is. In this important arena of methodologies, there's still some gaps to be filled. We're not actually yet giving people enough guidance as to how to go about developing systems of using different technologies. Now, insofar as the methodology and repository is concerned, I like to believe that the methodology and the tools should be independent of each other. The methodology has to be a framework that will stand the course of time. Tools are going to come and go, but you need something that's going to give you a bit more stability, and that's where the repository comes into place. Hopefully, that's where we can store the data from the various tools, and regardless of which tool we ultimately use, we can still build on the database we've built. Perhaps, as Roger mentioned, we may lose some semantics, but to me, the methodology and the repository gives you some order, and the tools basically are just devices to allow you to do things productively.
Is the methodology then very much a technical domain of what you're doing, or do they have actually business uses? to people from the general business side getting involved with methodologies?
Oh, absolutely, yes. I mean, that's
Because their main criticism is they're too technical.
Well, I think people eventually, if they're living in a technical world, they have to wrestle with technical issues. You can't just deny that they're there. But the whole notion of methodologies really is to understand your business. And IBM's recommended strategy for approaching AD cycle, very similar to what Roger's outlined, is to start by establishing a methodology, then to go on and understand your business by understanding the data, and then to actually create a model of the enterprise. And only at that point do you go out and do an inventory of what you have as application development tools. No doubt IBM at that point would say, well, perhaps you should just replace Telon with CSP or whatever. But that comes very low down in the order. The important thing is to understand what you're trying to do before you actually buy the tools to do it. And IBM is firmly committed to that.
Obviously training is a major issue. It's come out of virtually all the services that have been done, either retraining people to use a new methodology or training completely naive users in order to use a new methodology. A lot of companies aren't really sort of going the training route at all. I just think there's just no money left for retraining in today's environment.
Well,
that's a serious drawback.
Well, yes, obviously, yes, absolutely.
You know,
I mean, methodologies are really abstractions, and they're not. One can copyright and patent certain aspects of them.
What I'm really asking is, are people's attitudes going to be changed? Are they just simply not going to, I'm just not going to go through the training period at the moment, I'm going to stick with what I've got and see what emerges perhaps in a year's time?
That seems quite likely, as we've all been saying. There are not, right here and now, immediate benefits to be gained from going out and signing a contract and buying some products. But there would be, the whole thing is a long-term process of, first of all, establishing what you're trying to do before you buy the products to do it. I suspect in the current climate, people are going to be very reluctant to take it up because it's a long-term payback.
Roger, what do you feel are limitations of CASE at the moment?
I think it's chiefly in, first of all, integration. The fact that the productivity gains are limited by the fact that the tools that you have as various parts of CASE have difficulties in working together. There's a buzzword going around at the moment called impedance mismatch. And that's a highfalutin way of saying that every time you have to cross a bridge between one tool and another, you have a big productivity loss. And I think that's one reason why CASE is still in problems. The other one I would say is that the organizational setup and the training to get it to work well still doesn't exist. What you often find in firms is that you find several bright people trained in one particular aspect of the methodology. You find a whole host of keen people on data analysis or data flow diagrams, and they confuse that particular technique with understanding of the methodology overall. And it's getting over that problem about the training, which sometimes I think is the reason why CASE perhaps doesn't get the productivity it should.
Do you feel that customers obviously who have the basic elements of ABCycle have the sort of infrastructure in place at the moment to take full advantage of it?
A lot of this comes down to the commitment the organisation has made to CASE. It's not really a matter of how many copies of whatever software you've got or which tools you use. I hate to say this, being someone who has a tool to market, but it's really to do with, are you intent on making this work? Do you understand what it's going to take to make this work? Are you willing to invest in this to get the benefits later? Now, those are the issues you go through when you start thinking through the implementation of any system. And what we've been talking about this morning is a system for IT people as opposed to a system for an end user. So it requires commitment and money and a desire to make it work. I was speaking to a journalist recently and I said, how is it I don't read too many success stories about CASE implementation? And he said, well, there's not as newsworthy as CASE failures. Do you know any good CASE failures? And it's going to take an awful lot to get over that hump, I think. And the more that people can do to publish, the more I think it's going to draw people into CASE.